to USHCA's very special author series events on Chinese Americans in the Heartland, migration, work, and community. I'm very excited tonight that Dr. Huping Ling can join us. Before we introduce her, I do want to run through a few housekeeping things. First of all, I want to thank the Chinese American Museum of Chicago for making tonight's event possible, helping us organize. I want to give a very special shout out to Su Lon Moy, Mabel Menard, as well as Israel Avicedo at the Chinese American Museum. Thank you again so much for being a partner with us. My name is Jason Conley. If you haven't met me, I work for the U.S. Heartland China Association, where we believe not all bridges are built of concrete and steel. Equally important bridges are built on friendship, cultural communion, and commercial cooperation. Where these bridges exist, communities flourish. Quick note about tonight's webinar: if at any point you'd like to ask a question to myself or our author, please leverage that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And then at the end of the webinar, when you leave, there will be a short survey option. If you'd like to give us some feedback on how we're doing or other programs or books you'd like to see us review, please let us know. So without further ado, I am very, very thrilled to introduce someone that I am a fan of and that we're so lucky to partner with and have us join us tonight is Dr. Huping Ling, an internationally renowned historian and prolific award-winning writer. Huping Ling is professor of history, the founder of the Asian and Asian American Studies program, and the past department chair at Truman State University in Kirksville, Missouri. She is the visiting fellow of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, the Tangjiang Scholar Chair Professor of the Chinese Ministry of Education, distinguished honorary professor at Lishui University, and a visiting professor at the Institute of Overseas Chinese Studies at Jinan University. She is the founding and inaugural book series editor for Asian American Studies Today for Rutgers University Press, on the editorial board of Overseas Chinese History Study, and also serves as a consultant to the Guangdong provincial government. A Ford Foundation Prize-winning author, she has authored and edited 34 books and published over 200 articles in Asian American studies on immigration and ethnicity, assimilation and adoption, transnationalism, family and marriage, employment patterns, and community structures. Her second most recent book, Chinese Americans in the Heartland, Migration, Work, and Community, focuses on the heartland cities, in particular of Chicago and St. Louis, as a case study to study the American heartland. This book draws rich evidence from various government records, personal stories, interviews, media reports, and sheds lights on the commonalities and uniqueness of the region as compared to the Asian American communities on the East and West Coast. If you have not read this book, I highly encourage you to do so. We'll leave links so you can check it out after the call. I have, and I just want to say, I feel so lucky to just so happen to live in Chicago. It's so fascinating to see this history come to life. So many of the things you talk about in the book are still there today. So I do want to turn the mic over to Dr. Huping Ling. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jason, for the very generous introduction, and thank you, Ming, for sponsoring the event and also join our co-sponsor. Thank you, our co-sponsor, Chinese American Museum of Chicago. Okay, let me come to my PowerPoint. Okay. I have been asked to say a few words on how I came to writing this book. Okay, so this is a long process. I entered the field of Asian American studies in mid-1980s. Then I realized that the Midwest area has been severely underrepresented. So I started put my energy and time in the area. In 1991, I joined the faculty at Truman State University. So I had more intensive research, observation, and participating activities in the area. In 2004, I published the book Chinese in St. Louis, which is a comprehensive history of Chinese in St. Louis from 1857 to present time. And in 2007, I published Chinese St. Louis in a pictorial work, and also Voices of Heart, which is our history of Asian American women in Midwest on their family, community, and migration. In 2012, I published The Chinese in Chicago. It is a comprehensive history of Chicago Chinese from 1870s to present time. And the recent book, Chinese Americans in the Heartland, is a culmination of those previous work. It mainly focuses on these two cities of Chicago and St. Louis. Okay. Before I get into the book, I want to have a little brief history. Okay, this is outline. I'm going to talk in this about 15-20 minutes. First, very brief history of Chinese migration and how they migrated to the Heartland. Then we're going to focus on the Chinese American Heartland story. Then compare the difference and similarities between the coastal Chinese American community and the Midland. Then conclusion, and finally we're going to have discussion and question and answers. Okay, from 1849 to 1882, roughly there are about 370,000 Chinese came to California following the gold rush. Just a comparison, around the same time period, about 35 million European immigrants came. The presence of Chinese on the West Coast resulted in the anti-Chinese resentment on the West Coast, propelled by Native Americanists and white laborers along with politicians. So they pushed for Congress to pass a law, which is called the Chinese Exclusion Law in 1882, which banned Chinese laborers from coming for 10 years, then later renewed again and again and until indefinitely. However, the Chinese participation in 1940, since 1942, during the World War II, changed the tidal wave. So Congress repealed this act in 1943. In 1965, there was a further change in American immigration law, which allowed families of Americans and trained laborers and war refugees, asylum seekers to come to the country. Okay. Since then, the more immigrants came to the country. Today, Asian American comprise of 19 million of the total country's population, which is roughly 7.2%, of which 25% are Chinese. Okay. So how did the Chinese come to the Midland? After the anti-Chinese movement in 1870s on the West Coast, they dispersed from the West Coast to Midland and the South. Okay. In the Midwest, they mainly focused on these two port cities, Chicago and St. Louis. And in the book, I covered mainly these two cities. There are a lot of similarities as well as a difference between them. The similarities are both of them are port cities. Okay, the Chicago is in the Five Lake area, while the St. Louis is in the confluence of Mississippi River and Missouri River. So that provided accessibilities for new immigrants. And they all had Chinatowns before 1965. And before 1965, they are all dominated by the community organizations called Anliang. But the difference appeared since 1965. In St. Louis, cultural community became a dominant community pattern in St. Louis, while in Chicago, we see a tripartite divide, which is South Chinatown, mainly Chinese immigrants and their descendants, and the North Chinatown, which is ethnic Chinese from Southeast Asia since 1970s. While in the suburban area, there are also the similar cultural community like that in St. Louis. So now we can get into the more close picture. In those Chinese community district, or so-called Chinatown, before 1965, all this Chinatown are conveniently located in the downtown area. And they concentrated the so-called niche economy, which is hand laundry, grocery store, and the restaurant business. So let's look at where is Chinatown in St. Louis located, which is nicknamed called Hop Alley, okay, from 1870s until 1966. In this area, in this map is in this shaded area, dark area along the riverfront. Okay, why it says 1870 to 1966? Because it was leveled in 1966 to make way for the parking lot of the Bush Stadium. So now we zoom into the Hop Alley. We can see here in the downtown area is between 7th and 8th Street and Market and Walnut Street. Here, Chinese operated their laundry, grocery stores, and restaurants. So we're going to look at the story of Samoa Laundry as an example. Okay. Samoa Laundry actually existed around the turn of the century. Initially was run by an old man called Samoa, but he became old. Then he arranged his two nephews come to the city. The two nephews are the brothers in their 20s. Older brother married, the younger one never married. They first came to Chicago. From there, they learned the laundry business. Then they came to St. Louis and inherited the store. They also continued to call it Samoa Laundry after their uncle died, okay, in 1922. And eventually this laundry closed in 1986. So the two brothers, older brothers, also known was called Samoa, although his real name was Zhu Qiwan. And his younger brother in this picture is called Zhu Qitun. And they operated the laundry in a very frugal way. And they live on their premises, which is located on 4381 Laclede Avenue, where they worked from dawn to dusk, okay, more than 12 hours a day. And they used this century-old dryer, clothes dryer. And they operate their store in a very primitive way. In the front of the store, there's a room. And there's a huge table there where they piled their laundry parcels, acrobat, their paperwork, and they receive their parcel and then gave the clean laundry back to their customers. The reason this survived and was popular because it had very low cost. Okay, so this is the price of their laundry service. Okay, we can see here it's a kind of small, but here from the second line here, you can see that to laundry a shirt, it cost only 25 cents. So this price lasted for decades, almost in 1960s, 70s, still the same price. That's how they lasted that long. Okay, so which is most how the Chinese laundry operated. They live in the back of their store with the help of their children. Okay, these two brothers were lonely without their family, but most Chinese laundry businessmen had the help from their children. The Chinese grocery stores, I want to use the example of in Chicago, because Chicago has much more extensive Chinatown, and the grocery business there are more extensive and complex. And there, they served as wholesale centers for the entire Midwest. Okay, for example, Huping, which is a store operated by the so-called Moy brothers. Okay, there are some other Chinese historical books also portray the Moy brothers. The three Moy brothers, the first Moy brothers came to came to Chicago in 1870s. There, he started the first Chinese grocery store. Then gradually he brought his younger brothers to the town. Then gradually he also arranged his clan members, then several hundred mois in Chicago. So slowly, several thousand of mois in Chicago Chinatown. So this hip long store was in so-called Old Chinatown, which is in South Clark Street. There, they mainly hired their clan members. So this business has a very clear ethnic network. The characteristics of depending on ethnic networks for its operation. Okay, they use the collect capital from clan members, then hire their relatives as employees, and the stores had multiple features. It was not only a store, but also served as bank as well as a hotel. They also served as hotel centers, wholesale centers for the entire Midwest area. And also some served, there's traveling grocery stores to serve the laundries which are far away from the downtown areas. The Chinese restaurant in Chicago was referred, those restaurateurs are referred as pioneers of the Chinese fine dining in Chicago. So people might think that the Chinese fine dining or these large restaurants probably started in San Francisco or New York. But actually, the earliest, most extravagant restaurant started in Chicago. The one which was known as Kim Jong-Loi Mandarin Restaurant, which Chinese American Museum of Chicago had exhibit. It may still have it on now. So the hotel, the restaurant owner is a man named Qin Fang Foy. We have it here. You can see he dressed dashly okay, in the Western suit, and his wife also was in Victoria dress. So he came to the country in a very early age. He not only learned English, but also German as well. He joined exclusive social club, and he navigated in the Chicago, not only Chinatown, but also the mainstream Chinatown freely. And his restaurant was equipped with very extravagant decor, and it was believed that the tables had the marble tops. And not only that, the Chinese restaurant in Chicago also believed are very sizable. For example, a restaurant called the Golden Pheasant Inn, it has as large as 75,000 capital, 30 shareholders, and 175 tables and 75 employees, which in today's rate is also very, very huge, okay, very sizable. Chinese restaurateurs are also very savvy. They promoted their business. They take the opportunity of the World Fair in 1893, promoted it savvily. Okay, they started the company called the Wamei Corporation, and they also set up a restaurant, a model restaurant called the Chinese Cafe, where they invited chef from Hong Kong, cooked elaborate Chinese meals, and they also provided both chopsticks as well as Western silverwares, okay, to accommodate their customers. So using that opportunities, they helped make the Chinese food popular and more acceptable for the American eaters. In the post-1965, in Chicago, as I said earlier, there's difference between St. Louis and Chicago. While in the St. Louis, the cultural community was a major community structure, but in Chicago, we see a tripartite divide. In South Chinatown, so this map can outline this tripartite situation. In the south, we see this is the area of the so-called South Chinatown from 1912 till now. And here you can see the middle area is the so-called Old Chinatown from 1880s to 1974. The Old Chinatown in 1912, most business moved here because of the push by the landlord there by raising rental. So the most Chinese businesses moved to the southern part of the town where the rent is cheaper. Okay, so this is how the South Chinatown or the current major Chinatown. Where in the north, in the Argyle Street area, we see the North Chinatown, which is primarily ethnic Chinese who came to Chicago following the fall of Saigon in 1974-75. And because the South Chinatown already overcrowded, so we revitalized North Town. Okay, so it becomes so-called North Chinatown. Where in the suburban areas, we can see here, there's areas of Chinese communities. They have the similar structures as that in St. Louis. I call them cultural community. Okay. So in this picture, we see South Chinatown. This is a gateway of South Chinatown. And this building behind, we all know that, okay, this used to be the headquarters of Anliang. And later on, Anliang had a school, okay, the Chinese school, language school there. But currently it's run by the various business. Okay. And this picture is North Chinatown. We can see from this sign of the business, they have trilingual signs. Okay, here we see Chinese characters, English, and here is Vietnamese. Okay, so indicating that they are catering a more diverse ethnic background community members. And in the suburbans, Westmont, this mall became a center of suburban Chicago Chinese. So let me explain a little bit of what is a cultural community. This is a term I coined in Chinese in St. Louis, interpreting the Chinese community in St. Louis after 1966, when Chinatown or Hop Alley was leveled to ashes to make way for Bush Stadium. So after that, the Chinese community centers re-emerged in several areas, but they never had a more established Chinatown areas. So even the local St. Louisans oftentimes wonder, do we have a Chinatown? Where are Chinese living? Where do they work? Okay. By census, there are more than 10,000 Chinese in St. Louis. But however, we don't see an extensive Chinatown. So this, where are they? So the most of them dispersed in suburban townships, areas, and neighborhoods. But they gathered during the weekend and the special holiday occasions in Chinese language schools, Chinese churches, and the community organizations, or large Chinese activities like Chinese New Year celebration. Okay, so this is a picture I took in 1990s Chinese language school, modern Chinese language school. During the weekends in Sunday, Chinese parents would send their children there to study Chinese language. Well, when they are waiting, they would communicate with community fairs, events, or having some classes. And during the Chinese celebration, they have an annual Chinese cultural celebration called the Chinese Cultural Days. Usually it's held in the mid-May held in Missouri Botanical Garden here. And they have activities like cooking, and model Chinese mock wedding, acrobats, and other cultural performances like here. The latest one last year in May, I went there, took the small recent pictures. Okay, this is a bridal sedan. And many people have been asking, so what are the difference and the similarities of Chinese in the Midwest and their counterparts on the East Coast? Okay, so here I made this kind of like a chart to highlight the differences and commonalities. Okay, the commonalities, I call them convergence. Okay, use the red color. And the differences, I call them divergences, use blue colors. Okay, so you can see that there are some, in some aspects, they're similar, but in many ways, they are different. Okay, I used 5 parameters to look at those commonalities and differences. First, we look at the localities. In both East Coast or West Coast, in the coastal area and the Midwest, Chinese communities are concentrated in the entry ports, okay, either entry ports in San Francisco or New York or Chicago, okay, the hinterland entry port, Chicago or the St. Louis. So those entry ports provide easy access for newcomers to come. But the differences here is that in the coastal communities, they are more likely from their sending countries, directly from their sending countries. So they have the international direct migration, where versus in Midwest, we also have international migration, but a lot of time, which is often is internal or regional migration or remigration. And they remigrated from either East Coast or West Coast to Midwest. Second, look at from the demographic. In the East Coast or West Coast, where the working class had a higher percentage, okay? By census, we see that the 60% of the community members are working class, work in the restaurants, garment shops, grocery stores. While in the Midwest, the majority of the community members, 80% of them, were professionals or self-employed small business owners. And the third parameters, the community structure. Before 1960s, we see in both coast and the Midwest, where we have this commercial and residential Chinatown type of communities. But since 1966, in the post-1960 area, in Los Angeles, there's a suburban Chinatown emerged. In New York, there's a so-called global Chinatowns, where there's a diversity of ethnic populations in the suburb, in New York, Manhattan, or in the other areas like Queens, okay? While in St. Louis and Chicago, the cultural community is quite a prominent community structure. So look at their economic structures. In the coastal area, where Chinese economy more relied on the ethnic networks. They had more connections across the country or even across the ocean with their homeland. But in the Midwest, Chinese communities not only depend on their ethnic network, but also depend on the larger, the mainstream population for their survival and prosperity. And finally, look at their integration, their interaction with the local community in the Midwest with a more friendly environment and also lower cost of living. As a result, there's a better socioeconomic integration of Asian Americans in the region. Okay. So I see I don't have much time, so I'm going to come to the conclusion that, so those studies placed Midwest Chinese American community or Asian American community to the map, to the national map, indicated their significant contribution to the local economy in the disproportion of their population. For example, in St. Louis before 1960s, the Chinese, that time their population was only 0.1% of the total population, but they provided 60% of the laundry service in the city. And their history was reflective of national history, and they provided a starting point for us to understand a broader national context. And this history provided clues for us how to meet today's challenges and opportunities. Okay, I'm going to stop at this point, and I will leave the stage to our host,
Yes.
Jason.
Yes. Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Ling, for that. And again, I just want to emphasize how important this work is and how important it is to have conversations like this for an organization like us that focuses on U.S.-China relations, relating back to Chinese American history. Who are we? How did we get here? What's the best way forward? And really throughout your presentation and just me reading your book, it's clear to see how important it is to kind of trace this history, starting with our challenges. What were Chinese Americans doing when they started immigrating to the United States, to the Heartland around the turn of the century? What are the triumphs that we see today? We're talking about starting the vocations available at the time was grocery work, merchant work, laundry work. And now, so we're starting about pioneering communities, and we're moving all the way to becoming influential figures in local politics, business, and the arts. So happy to be able to have a discussion today in looking forward to celebrating the upcoming Lunar New Year, celebrating Chinese Americans' migration, resilience, and rise to prominence. So thank you so much again for that background. I want to say, to start out our conversation for the evening, I want to pick on one thing that you mentioned in your presentation, which is cultural community. Here at USHCA, our community, it's so happy to see so many elements of that coming up through your talk, working so closely with the Chinese American Museum. Shout out to Mabel Menard, Sulon Moy, Israel Acevedo at the museum. I do believe that they have that Joy Lo restaurant on exhibit at the museum. If not, they did recently. So for our listeners, if you want to take this level further of getting immersed in seeing, for early Chinese Americans around the turn of the 20th century, what was life like then? Go to the museum, see their exhibits. It illustrates it so well. And then, another special shout out to the St. Louis Modern Chinese School. We had one of their teachers recently win our Heartland Chinese Teacher Award. So again, just coming back to this idea of community, so glad to see that that is represented in your work, in your book, and in tonight's discussion. I do want to start out with a question that I have personally, to kind of help frame this conversation for tonight. Something that I found really interesting in the introduction of your book is you leverage some census data, some immigration records, or well, I guess should say some transportation records of Chinese American populations. So you say that in 2000 to 2010, nearly 12 Midwestern states experienced growth in nearly 45% in their Asian and NHOPI populations, and then greater than 50% growth in 12 southern states. However, in California, Hawaii, and New York, there was nearly a 36% decrease in AAPI populations. So we're seeing, in summary, we're seeing a real growth here in the heartland of our Asian and NHOPI populations recently. So, kind of framing this in this discussion of history in your book, why now? Why are we seeing a revival in the heartland amongst AAPI communities, in your
Okay,
opinion?
so this is associated with the recent years social economic development in the country as well as in the world. Okay, since 1960s, so-called globalization became more and more apparent trend in the national and the global economy. So which enabled people to look more, explore more broader opportunities. And that resulted a large population shift and population movement from coastal area to the Midwest and the South, okay, where they see the land, the property cheaper, and the living standard with the same cost, with the same amount of money, they could have a more or even better living standard. The urban, another issue is that the urban crowdedness on the West Coast, especially in California and in New York, also push the population going out. Okay, so-called it's urban flight, and it was called another great migration to Midwest and the South. Okay. As a result, we see the huge population increase in southern cities like Houston, Austin, and in the Midwest cities like in Chicago, okay, as well as in St. Louis. Okay. So as a result, the communities in Midwest also see the drastic population increase, even though, overall the picture, the majority of Asian American population still is concentrated in the East and the West Coast. But locally, the percentage wise, we see a large increase in the population percent in the Midwest and the South.
Yeah, so more economic development today. I know back around the 19th century, you write in your book, one of the larger motivations of transporting Chinese immigration from the West Coast to the South was the Great Transcontinental Railroad construction. Um, and we do have some special guests who is going to talk a little bit about Chinese groceries in the South. But if you could elaborate a little bit more, talking about the infrastructure of our country, it's kind of a common adage now. This country is built on the back of immigrants. This transcontinental railroad building, I believe it was around 90% of the employees for one company at least were all of Chinese descent. Could you elaborate a little bit more on how that's kind of helped shape the communities that we see today?
Okay, yeah. Transcontinental Railroad started after the end of the Civil War and it completed in 1869. And they started in both ends. Okay, in the east end, start from St. Louis. Okay, that's why the St. Louis is called Gate City, from the Missouri River, push to the west. While from the west end, start from California and moving east. And in the western part of this railroad, as you said earlier, 90% of the employees are Chinese. Okay, so roughly 120,000 Chinese were hired in, more than 12,000 Chinese were employed, okay, in the railroad construction. And the Chinese small, but they worked collectively, okay, in gangs and effectively. So initially it was used as experiment. They just hired about 50 or so, but the Chinese proved they are very efficient and effective. So eventually 90% of the employees were Chinese. So it ended in 1969. After that, many Chinese railroad workers dispersed into the country, and many of them came to the Midwest or South. Okay, so probably that also contributed to the emergence of Chinatown or Chinese communities in the Midwest and the South. And of course, more importantly, this transcontinental railroad linked the country east and west together economically. And also it linked the country's industry and agriculture together. And Chicago especially as a distribution center where the agricultural produces were distributed to Midwest and other part of the country. And so the Midwest began to become an integral part of the entire country's economy.
Thank you. So kind of talking about earlier formations of Chinese American communities that we see today. I do have a question about this later, kind of about the World's Fair, their impact on perspectives of Chinese Americans, how that helped advance Chinese American businesses at the time. One thing I am curious about is, of course, when people think about Chinatowns, they're thinking about West Coast, they're thinking about New York, in Canada, they may be thinking about Vancouver or Toronto. But of course, the main point of this book and our discussion today is the Heartland. So for Chicago, what role, and this is for me as a Chicagoan, talking about the World's Fair, formed our museums, it's a lot of our current tourist attractions. I know in your book you also elaborate how the World's Fair impacted, I believe you call it an early prototype of Chinatown. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on some of the pressures at the time from the World's Fair, that situation, how that kind of contributed to some of the Chinatowns and the centers of Chinese American society that we see today.
Great, it's a great question. Yeah, so it so happened that the two World Fairs, one in 1893 and one in 1904. Okay, this 10 years apart. So happened in both Chicago and St. Louis. Okay, let me focus on the first one, the one in Chicago in 1893. So this one, the Chinese participated, but later on the Chinese Qing government boycotted this event and refused to collaborate. So the Chinese community here, they joined the force, raised the funds, and they started a company. It's called Wame Incorporation to organize the fair. Okay, so I had that in the earlier PowerPoint, and very successfully they promoted the Chinese business, and the entire Chinatown participated. The very good example is that there's a Chinese cafe where they provided samples of the Chinese fine dinings, but also there's other Chinese fairs. They had displays of how to count in Chinese, how to use the Chinese abacus and other Chinese artifacts. And this participation really made the entire community very proud of, and it set up the Chinatown, Chicago Chinatown, as a center of both grocery wholesale distribution as well as fine dining. And Chicago also set up its place as a central port city where whenever Chinese dignitaries, famous people come to the United States, they would stop. Okay, they of course would visit New York, then they would make a stop in Chicago, and of course Kang Youwei stopped in Chicago, and later on Sun Yat-sen and Madam Chiang Kai-shek, okay, the wife of President Chiang Kai-shek in 1943, stopped in Chicago. So that all helped Chicago to set up its place as important metropolitan area in the Midwest. Where in St. Louis, if it's a different story. Chinese this time actively participated in the World Fair. It was organized by the Chinese prince, okay, the Manchu prince, Prince Kong. They organized, they formed the organization and had large members and the huge wealth. And Prince Gong and his wife came, and his wife carried many suitcases, trunks of her costumes, Chinese costumes. She would change them and elaborately. So that caused a lot of fanfare in St. Louis, and the local celebrities would like to see how the Chinese looked. And this fair also provided similarly pride, okay, for the local Chinese communities. But meanwhile, okay, as you said, how did it impact the Chinatown? Because there's a rumor that some Chinese might be smuggled in, okay, disguised as a delegation of the Chinese and smuggled into the city. So that also resulted in the police, St. Louis police, to search this Chinese delegations. Okay, but overall, I think this two participations of Chinese in the World Fairs are great success, okay? And they have been really well recorded in mainstream business, in the mainstream publications, and inspired a lot of publicities and studies. And I also personally, speaking of South, I interviewed some community members in St. Louis, and many of them actually shared similar histories that they not only came from Chicago, and many of them also, St. Louis community, Chinese community members also came from Deep South. Okay, one lady, her family started a grocery store in Arkansas. Okay, and they said they are the only Chinese family there, and they considered that they are more white, okay, because at that time the community regard, okay, if they're not black, then they're white. So they enrolled in the public schools with all the white children, and they integrated in the larger society, okay. But at the same time, they also experienced discriminations, the similar hardships as Chinese in the other communities.
Yeah. So I think your point on the South is so interesting. It's a perfect segue. I do want to introduce a personal friend of mine, Baldwin Show. But going back to this point of kind of this black and white binary, and then the Chinese in the Deep South, where do they fit in? I remember reading that in the book about how she said, I'm not Chinese anymore, which is just it's an interesting discussion for a different day. But Baldwin Show is on the line here. I got to know Baldwin, I think about a year and a half ago now, when we actually did a tour of Mississippi for his film Far East Deep South, which is the story of his great-grandfather's immigration to Mississippi, where he opens a Chinese grocery store. So kind of, Chicago as a gateway for the Midwest, St. Louis as a gateway for the South. Baldwin, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your movie, and where the people can check it out. And then also, I don't know if anything that Dr. Ling has said today that kind of resonates with your story.
Yeah, nice to meet you, Bob. And we haven't met, but I'm very familiar with your story and your film and your wife's work. It's a great film.
Thank you, Dr. Ling, for just sharing right now. And I learned a lot just by listening to you. Yeah, Far East Deep South takes us. First of all, hi everybody. Good to see you again, Jason. Min, I see you there too. And I've loved the relationship that we had with U.S. Heartland China Association. It was wonderful. We continue to talk about it. And one of the highlights that we've done was we've gone on tour with our film, Far East Deep South, which is about our discovery of my grandfather, great-grandfather, and great-grandmother, who were in, not when we traced our family lineage, we didn't trace them back to China, we traced them into Mississippi. And so the story takes us all on a journey where we discover for the first time our family roots in the Deep South, and how that impact really changed our lives, changed the way we looked at ourselves and our American identity, actually our identity as a whole, not just as Americans, but as Asian Americans, as Chinese Americans, as people of Chinese descent. All those different ways of identifying ourselves, it was all changed by that moment when we realized that we had this lineage that expanded 150 years into the South. So with that, Dr. Ling, I really loved listening to you, and especially that last part when you talked about Arkansas and when you got into the Deep South. And one thing I would just want to chime in on is that the Deep South in itself is very different, just like as you're saying with the history in St. Louis versus Chicago, even though they're both, you know, Midwest. The history is different, the dynamics are different, the people that they're around were different. And the same thing when we're talking about Mississippi or even Arkansas, just on the other side of the river, where actually in Mississippi there were many parts in Mississippi where Chinese could not go to the white schools, whereas many of them in Mississippi would move over to Arkansas just so that they could attend those schools. And in Mississippi, where the Chinese, especially if you go back far enough, they would be considered colored. So you would have Black and Chinese all living in the same community, the colored areas, whereas the white, even Italians and Jews were considered colored. So they would actually live in the same colored communities. So those are different dynamics. And of course, we're talking about Chicago with the Great Migration. A lot of the Black community did eventually move up from Mississippi to the Chicago area. And it's very interesting how even in Chicago, where the Black community and Chinatown are like right next to each other, very similar to how it was in Mississippi and along the Delta.
Yeah. So really, Bob will quickly chime in. One of the reasons we work with you on the Far East Deep South tour and also invited Dr. Ling to speak is because the history is very relevant today. We are facing widespread anti-foreign land ownership law being copy-pasted across the state. So is that hurting our community in some way? Because, you know, how is that impacting us? Again, there are a couple of questions that was raised as well. Again, that was my first question, is that, you know, you look at the Heartland, the challenge today, how does the history inform us about what's happening today?
Okay, great. Yeah, that's a great question. And then I'd like to provide some background. So this, the current happening is kind of mirrored the history, okay? In the history, there's a so-called alien land law, okay, which passed in first in 1870s, then gradually spread 1880s, 1890s. About 30-some states have this alien land law. Initially, this law was passed against absentee landlordism, okay, which mostly are the British. But slowly after 1870s, it became to all aliens, but mainly the aliens, so-called the Orientals, Chinese, Japanese. Okay, and the alien land law passed on the West Coast in California and Washington mainly target Chinese and the Japanese. However, the Chinese, Japanese, or Indians, they did find a way to take a loophole to survive even under that situation. Okay, for example, many Japanese farmers on the West Coast, they would use their children, okay, which is American born. They would be naturalized by birth, so they're American citizens. So they would register the land under the name of their children. So that way they could become landowners. Okay, so this is one way, the loopholes. In the South Asian Americans, like the Indian communities, some also took loopholes that they hired certain lawyers and registered their land under some incorporation. And in that manner, they were able to operate and also lease their land out. Okay, so that's what is done historically. Currently, of course, I'm sure this legislature would discourage the buyers from the foreign countries. Okay, even though it was not directly exclusively targeting Chinese, all the foreigners, okay, aliens were included. I think, yeah, there would be impact there, complicated situation.
I think that to kind of help frame history, how it relates today, another point that I'm interested in the book, and then we do want to turn to some audience questions. I know I've seen a few. Again, if you have any, please feel free to leverage that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. One thing that I found really interesting in the book is in reference to the growing Chinese American presence in the late 19th century, tension between the Qing government at the time and the American government. You quote a Princeton article saying, unlike the violent anti-Chinese outbreaks that occurred in New York, Boston, or Milwaukee at the turn of the century, the opposition to Chinese in Chicago took a different form, economic sanctions. And that, I believe, is what actually led to the Chinatown in Chicago being pushed south. So originally it was downtown, and now and then it got pushed south to where it is today. So, I think that this discussion of how foreign relationships can still affect Chinese American lives today is very obvious. And the most obvious answer being the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is a result of kind of bad international relations and formed a large part of history and where we are today. So I want to turn to some of the questions and pivot to some of the questions in the chat. The first one we got is kind of interesting, pointing to how Chicago, early 20th century, was known for its organized crime, and gangs, namely Al Capone and his syndicate. So when researching your book, the question is from Dan. Thank you, Dan. When researching your book, did you find any information regarding Chinese involved in Chicago's underworld?
I put a thumbs up on that question too. I want to know the answer.
It's interesting.
Okay, so you asking Dan or asking me?
So that's a question for you, Dr. Ling. And what's the relation to, I know there was some bad perception of An Liang and its perception.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the great.
So,
Yeah, yes. So the An Liang I can elaborate a little bit more. Okay. For those who come from the coastal cities, they are familiar with the so-called CCBA. That means the Chinese Benevolent Associations, or 6 companies. But in the Midwest area, the Chinese community organization is called An Liang. Okay, they had holding and dominance in East Coast and the Midwest. So An Liang, this term came from the Chinese term 出报安良, originally initiated from the late in the Qing dynasty. Okay, we know in China the Qing dynasty lasted from 1644 to 1911, which was started by a ethnic minority group called the Manchu. They are a small percentage, only 1/5 of the Chinese, 1/50 of the Chinese population. But this minority ruled China for 260 some years. So the ethnic Chinese, I mean the mainstream Chinese, or so-called Han Chinese. Okay, there's a lot of resentment as well as resistance. So a lot of underground resistance in the form of secret society. Okay, so some of them use this term 出报安良. Okay, so those secret societies organized to have activities opposed the Qing dynasty, and those activities also spilled over the overseas Chinese communities when Chinese migrated to the North America. So in the foreign land, they cannot the initial term 除暴安良, 除暴 means eliminate the despot. 安良 means bring peace to the land. Okay, so on the foreign land, they had no power to eliminate the despot, okay, which is a government. Okay, in China, the despot means the Manchu dynasty. But here, so this term mainly focuses on the anliang, the aspect anliang, the part, means maintain peace. So the overseas Chinese communities, initially, because this anti-Chinese sentiment, anti-Chinese legislation, and executions, there is a lack of police, effective police management and controlling of the Chinese area. And they would just leave the business to Chinese community themselves. So as a result, those Chinese community organizations emerged, become community organizations. And their leaders oftentimes dubbed as Chinese mayors, mayors of Chinatown. For example, in Chicago, the Moy brothers served as mayor of Chinatown for a long time. In St. Louis, the Chinese An Liang, the president, served as mayor of Chinatown. So An Liang in the Midwest, largely, they have multiple functions. They have economic, most importantly, and social, economic, and cultural, as well as the spiritual functions. Economically, they served as landowners because An Liang owned a lot of property. Many Chinese restaurants and rental properties were property of An Liang. An Liang also had member fees, which because most Chinese are poor, which is not significant amount. However, An Liang as a dominant economic force, it controlled economic activities in Chinatown. So they could dictate a Chinese immigrant life from how they landed in the entry port, how they are going to operate their business, and even to their family affairs, like weddings or funerals. So that made An Liang as a de facto community with government. So they oftentimes referred as a Chinese government. The head called mayor of Chinatown. So this is their, they served this economic role, and along with their, they have the legal role. Since police, American legal structure would leave the Chinese business to themselves, An Liang oftentimes served as a court, local court, during their annual meeting or irregular meetings to judge the local dispute between Chinese business operators. For example, An Liang has this 1 mile laundry rule. So An Liang dictated that the members should not have more than one laundry within a mile radius. So they will not compete among themselves. Some places also have the 1 mile restaurant. So if there's competition happens, An Liang would send a signal of warning, warning those parties to pull back. Otherwise, there will be unexpected incidents. Sometimes like mysterious fire happened, burned the Chinese laundry or Chinese restaurants. So the offenders would realize what happened. So they would back up. So by this way, by coercing or by, also they also do some community affairs to help the needed. But by various means, An Liang served as effective legal structure to rule the community. And culturally, An Liang also organized the major Chinese community fairs like a New Year celebration. Every year, they organize the Chinese New Year party. They invite the Chinese troops, Cantonese opera or Beijing Opera, to the community to have a performance. They also sponsored other affairs, okay, like provide the spiritual needs for the community members. In the early years, Chinese didn't intend to stay here. Okay, they are so-called sojourners. Okay, the term dubbed for the Chinese immigrants as sojourners, because they're coming here just sojourning. Eventually, they're going back to China. But in reality, is that many people never survived or never lived the day they returned to China. They died here, either disease or accidents. They murdered. So how to handle their remains, okay, become a major responsibility of Anliang. So the Anliang would wash the bones of their Chinese fellow men and clean them and dig them out, okay, from the local burials and clean the bone and wrap them in parcel and then ship them back to their hometown, okay, to Hong Kong first, then to their hometown in China, okay. And during the other event, wedding or celebrations, Anliang also use their meeting hall for those public affairs. Okay, so in this way, Anliang before 1966 served as an effective community organization. Okay. But it gradually phased out after 1960s because civil rights movement and also because the newer generations, Asian Americans, had college education, entered mainstream professions, jobs, and many of them also served as community activists. Okay, they had college education. Many of them majored in the social work. Okay, so they served as community workers, activists, helped the community, and they reached out more importantly and differently from the traditional organization such as Anliang or Six Companies, CCBA. They reached out to the mainstream society. They applied for federal fund, local fund, and raise fund from the community and the business owners to run their various activities. Okay, so those new community slowly replace Anliang or CCBA, and a variety of them, okay, including Chinese organization, for example, like OCA, okay, that means Organization of Chinese Americans, and also various Chinese churches, okay, Christian church, Buddhist churches, and Chinese language schools. Okay, in St. Louis, there are 2 or 3 major Chinese language schools. They all served as integral community structure to run the community events. For example, like what I said, the Chinese Day, China Day.
Professor Ling, I was going to take advantage of Baldwin being here because Baldwin lives in Los Angeles. He actually traveled us across many different heartland cities. And there's actually a question for him about civil rights movement activists who inspired by Chinese freedom fighters. I know Baldwin's a fighter himself. So Baldwin,
I'm a fighter.
What do you, please respond to that question by Kira Lai, and also maybe your observation from traveling to so many different Chinatown.
Yeah, I know Jason Chu. I don't know if it's the same Jason Chu as asking this question. I think your question is actually talked about Southern Chinese immigrants as opposed to the Chinese in the South. So I'm not too familiar with the answer as far as civil rights with Chinese freedom fighters as being the inspiration. But what I do know is that when we're talking about civil rights in the South, there were actually many Chinese that joined the march with Martin Luther King during the civil rights during that time when we had the civil rights marches. There was a lot of Chinese that were in the South already, especially in the Mississippi and in the Alabama area. And actually, there were Chinese that traveled from California, would travel all the way to the South in Alabama and to do the march with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So we do know that Chinese have been active were activists during that time. We also know that Chinese, also going even further back, there were Chinese that fought in the Civil War, and yes, both the north side and the south side. So there are definitely historical points of Chinese that are from the south that have participated in these movements for social justice, which going back to even the Civil War and as well as civil rights movement in the 1960s.
So talking about regional differences, I do want to point to another question in the chat from Ken Quinn. Thanks, Ambassador Quinn. Kind of an interesting question. I do want to point this to Dr. Ling. I do imagine that you have an answer, and I imagine I can guess what it is. Is the geographic origin within China for immigrants known? That's the first question. And if so, does it reflect different levels of success or different vocations once they reach America?
Okay, can you repeat it again one more time?
Yeah. Two-pronged question. Are the geographic origins within China known when immigrating to the US? And did that impact where they ended up in life in terms of career or success they had?
Oh, okay. Yeah, this is a great question. Yeah. Oh, the geographical origin certainly impact their landing place and their settlement patterns and job opportunities. In the earlier time, before 1960s, okay, let me again also divide this. Okay. Before the 1960s, the most Chinese immigrants from South China, okay, mainly in the Canton area, Guangdong province. Okay, they speak Cantonese, and most of them were engaged in restaurant and grocery store this business and their labors largely. And they speak Cantonese. And even in the Chinese community, there are many residents could stay and live their entire life without knowing an English word, okay, English language. Okay. But the picture about the post-1960s immigrants are very different. Okay. So first, we see a large regional difference. Well, the older immigrants mainly from southern China, Canton area. But the newer immigrants are from broad areas, okay, mainly from capital city, the large cities, okay, capital cities like Beijing and or other so-called the Chinese called the municipalities like Shanghai, Tianjin, and in recent years also many from northeast cities, those northeast part of China. And another difference, their educational background also are very different from the earlier immigrants. Okay. The newer immigrants are more educated and also from a broad occupational background. Okay. Many of them also had college education or even advanced degrees, the masters, some even PhDs before immigration. And therefore, where they settled also varies. Okay. In early time, they joined their country fellows in New York, in San Francisco's. But in the recent times, we can see them. Many of them could be anywhere, landed in any areas. That's why we see the large population gain in Midwest and the South. Right? And in St. Louis and Chicago, we also see these regional differences here. In Chicago, Chinese, in South Chinatown, you can see most of them are the older immigrants. Okay, so there are many more residents speaking Cantonese. Okay, but also in the recent year, there are also more and more speaking Mandarin, Chinese, or Shanghai dialects. Where in the northern Chinatown, you see, in addition to Cantonese, Mandarin, and also there's other Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Hmong, those different languages. The same situation also happened in other Chinese communities. And also, yeah, professionally, we also see the differences that the newer immigrants more likely landed in the high tech or in the professional jobs like engineers, professors, medical providers, or as small business owners.
And I live close to that North Chinatown, so I can attest to that. We did have one other question on the chat, in the chat, kind of about regional differences. Maggie Marchioni is a young scholar from St. Louis studying at WashU. Maggie, did you want to come on and actually ask a question of Dr. Ling?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Hi, Maggie. Yeah.
It was wonderful. I've actually been conducting research about China's participation in 1904 World's Fair here in St. Louis. So this webinar and your book is definitely very relevant to what I have been researching so far. I was really interested by what you said about the fact that when the World's Fair in Chicago took place, the Qing government boycotted the event. I did read some articles about this when I was researching about the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis. But then I was just wondering if the Qing government was willing to participate officially in the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, why did it boycott Chinese participation just 10 years earlier? Like, what do you think led to this change in approach?
It's very good. Yeah, you're very sharp. Good eye. Okay, why there's this difference? Okay, in 1893, Chinese boycotted mainly because of the mistreatment of Chinese immigrants in the United States. Okay, since the passage of 1882 Chinese exclusion laws. Okay, Chinese were banned from coming. Chinese who remained here were physically, some on the West Coast especially, physically assaulted. Some are even murdered. Okay, and kidnapped, and they were mistreated. And as a result, the Chinese common folks boycotted in China, and the Chinese government had to take some, at least as a gesture, to boycott in order to protest the mistreatment of Chinese in the United States. So that is why they boycotted it. But still, it's not, doesn't mean there's absolutely no participation. Okay, so there's a large Chinese private business, and also some joint, even the international entrepreneurs also sponsored the Chinese participation in the 1893 fair. It's a good question.
Yes, this makes a lot of sense because although the Qing government agreed to participate in the 1904 World's Fair, it almost revoked its participation in 1902 because the Chinese Exclusion Act was renewed. And an interesting thing I found was the only reason why they decided to participate was because the fair's president pitched the business opportunities that there would be in America if China participated and kind of showcased its products and all of this. So thank you so much.
Yeah, that's also a great point. Okay, you know, Chinese government also has this mentality. Chinese like to have this so-called face. Okay, they like to show off the grandeur of the Chinese culture. Okay, how huge the land, how rich the produce, and how much we own this country. So they feel this is opportunity for them to display the wealth or the cultural advance. And because they believe the Chinese thousands of years of civilizations would be more glorious compared to this barbarian, those technologies. And so they take this as a showcase. And for example, as I said earlier, the Prince Kung and his wife did brought a lot of the Chinese costumes and showcased aspect of the Chinese culture. And certainly they also look at the economic business to promote business opportunities for China and Chinese.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Maggie. That's in relation to the book. That's a really interesting connection that St. Louis and Chicago share when it comes to Chinese Americans. I want to go back to the Anliang Association. Kind of an interesting point talking about Chicago, St. Louis. They have this rule that you can't build restaurants or laundries within a mile of each other. That's not a rule that applied to every state. That was kind of a unique problem that St. Louis and Chicago shared. In other states, like Mississippi, sometimes these grocery stores were the only place around for miles.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
when Baldwin and I were touring around Mississippi, I was just shocked at how many times people would come up to us after these film screenings we did, and they would say, I remember this Chinese grocery store that was down the street, or my grandfather was a patron at one of these Chinese grocery stores that he would frequent all the time. And this, for these more rural, less populated communities, this
Yeah.
was very much in the public eye, and it was really, really a way to cement Chinese American presence in the heartland, in the Deep South. Baldwin, you've traveled all across the country. You've done a lot of great activism work. What else have you seen in terms of the presence of the perception of Chinese Americans in the Deep South?
Yeah, one of the things that is that if people actually remember, or if people have been in the Deep South for a long time, like multiple generations, then it's easier for them to realize and remember that yes, the Chinese community has been there and they're very American. If you go there now, even as I was kind of thinking some more about that previous question, um, the, a lot of the Chinese, in fact, most of the Chinese, almost 50% of the Chinese men in Mississippi entered the military service. And what happened there was that this is so during World War II, especially, and when we're talking about civil rights happening in the 60s, right? It was really because part of the reason was when the Chinese went to serve in the military, they served with a lot of African Americans. And then they realized that their community, they were living in the colored areas, right? So those friendships continued to grow. And so when the Chinese returned back from military, whether it be in Mississippi or even out of California or other places where they might have joined the military, their friendships actually built a relationship with the Black community, which encouraged Chinese citizens, or just Chinese, maybe they weren't really citizens yet either, but Chinese people that lived in America, would encourage them to also join in activist type movements such as the civil rights movement. As far as the South goes, I mean, it's just a little different. They didn't have the 1 mile rule. I mean, Jason, when we were going there, on the block where my grandfather and great grandfather's store was, there was like 4 Chinese stores like right next to each other. So it wasn't like 4 miles apart. It was just like 40 feet apart, right? And so in that sense, what the Chinese did was different in that they came together and helped each other start stores. And then when they're done starting one store, they would help start another store right next to it and right next to it. And it was more of a, hey, in order for us to kind of survive in this segregated environment, this Jim Crow environment, we can't, I mean, sure, there were other Chinese grocery stores, a few miles down as well, but it wasn't like a competition type of thing. It was a more of a, well, we kind of need all of us here together in order to survive through this type of environment at that point.
Yeah, great. Yeah, relating to what Jason said, a lot of the Chinese in the Deep South, as you said, 50% joined the army in order to maintain their friendship with their African American friends. And also probably more important is that because for the legal reason, St. Louis, we also see that the many Chinese participated in World War II. They joined there. The major draw for them is to become citizens. Okay?
Yes.
Because that time the Chinese exclusion law was not banned, and so to join the army, they can immediately become citizens.
Mm-hmm.
There's events there at the army army recruitment site. They have simultaneously this citizen swearing ceremony. Okay, so on one hand you sign up, become an enrollee, then you become a citizen. Okay, so join the army provided the important opportunity for them to become American citizens, and also similarly, and that provide a job opportunity for them, because prior to the World War II, is prior 1960s, job opportunities is limited for the Chinatown offsprings. Okay, the young Chinese Americans could only be confined in the Chinese laundry business, restaurants, but going to the army opened a new world for them and new opportunities in future.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned, I mean, in St. Louis, it was mostly restaurants and laundries, and certainly there were laundries in Mississippi as well. But we'll find that in Mississippi, it was mostly grocery stores.
Yeah.
And I think the reason for that was because it was mostly farming. That was really the type of community. So you didn't really have farmers, you know, taking their clothes in to get their laundry done because they're just going to get it dirty the next day. It wasn't like business type of work. But I think what happened with that also was that you can see in the poster, you know, there was Chinese working on plantations, and we go deeper into that history where the Chinese and the Black communities were together working on plantations, sharecropping. They had a situation where Chinese exclusion, like you were mentioning, had this law against Chinese laborers. So you know, working on a plantation or a farmland would be, quote unquote, relatively easy work, right? You didn't have to have a special skill, you just needed to work. So that would be actually the easiest way to get a job for someone that's Chinese with no special skills, where education was, let's just throw them in the field and let them work. But the Chinese Exclusion Act, as you mentioned, prevented that, as well as, you know, citizenship. So when Chinese were no longer able to work on plantations, while they were on plantations with the Black community, they realized that the commissaries were actually ripping everybody off. And so when the Chinese were actually forced off the land and said, like, hey, Chinese exclusion says no more laborers, the loophole, as you were mentioning earlier too, right? The loophole there was, well, they can be merchants, not because merchants was easier. I mean, it's not like today, oh yeah, we just get a business loan, get all this money, and if we fail, we just file bankruptcy and maybe get a government bailout. Like, there was none of that, right? The whole point of putting the loophole for merchants was like, it's gonna be harder than working on it, being a laborer, because you'll probably just go home. And so what the Chinese ended up doing in the Mississippi area was that they would start their own grocery stores, because that was the loophole, and they would charge a lower rate than the commissary and then extend the credit to the Black community at 0%. And that started a whole different type of business aspect, which actually worked out better than if they had a restaurant or if they had a laundromat, like they have in St. Louis.
You know, I'm so glad we get to have discussions like this, particularly this week, this month, Chinese New Year coming up during Black History Month. It's so important to create space for this and remember our history, remember our roots, and also guide this discussion back to the heartland. You know, what connects us? How is solidarity going to bring us all forward? So I know we were almost out of time. I'm going to open the door for any final questions, but before I do, you know, I want to thank Baldwin Cho coming on last minute as a special guest. Maggie, you're a young, rising, aspiring scholar in St. Louis. Thank you for coming on. And of course, Dr. Ling, thank you so much for all the work that you do, being a part of this session. And I think you can tell from the questions we're getting from the discussion, hopefully there's fruitful space for another book. So I'm sure we'll all follow your work closely. Do want to thank our organizational partner one last time, Chinese American Museum in Chicago. If any of this is interesting to you and you want to take that experience to another level, definitely make sure when you're in Chicago to stop by and check out some of the amazing work that they do. But yeah, thank you to everyone. Any final questions or words from Dr. Ling before we depart?
Well, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, Dr. Ling, I think, did you mention recently there was a event at the Bush Stadium where they actually acknowledged the destruction of the Chinatown? Was that recent?
I kind of vaguely, I think I read about it. And also in the Facebook, I see some posts. I don't, because I don't have exact information. I don't want to misleading people, but I'm sure, yeah, there is a recognition of Asian American contributions and presence.
Yeah, I think in Denver area, the mayor of Denver actually was the first mayor outside California a year ago to officially apologize for the destruction, the burning down of the Chinatown in Denver, which is no longer there. So recognizing what is missing is very important today too. But again, thank you so much, Baldwin. Thank you, Professor Ling, Jason. Great session, and we look forward to learning more about the history we had in the Heartland.
Thank you, everyone. Happy New Year.
You guys.
Thank you. 恭喜发财.
Yeah. Happy New Year.
Bye.
Right. 再见。
Yeah.
Thank you.